I've worked in the criminal justice system for 10 years. As a sexual offences prosecutor, my days have been spent seeing the aftermath of sexual violence, case after case after case. I work for an institution that can only respond to sexual violence one case at a time, and only after the damage has been done. Often, I feel impotent because no matter what I do in court, I can never reach back in time and undo what's happened. More than half of young Australian women will have experienced sexual violence by the time they're in their 20s, and more than half will have been sexually harassed since the age of 15. It's 1 in 20 for men. The devastation that this wreaks can be ruinous. Feeling frustrated by the limits of the criminal justice system, by 2019 I decided to fully focus on sexual violence prevention. It seemed the only solution to slow the steady stream of devastating, life-ruining case files hitting my desk. Consent education held the promise of a magical solution, a silver bullet to stop or reduce sexual violence. Now, I've been an advocate for education as a protective factor against sexual violence since doing my honours thesis in the topic at the very beginning of my career. But on consent education, I was never fully sold. See, consent education is a term that's used differently by people and institutions. Some use it to describe the provision of age-appropriate information and educational experiences about what constitutes giving and receiving consent in physical or sexual encounters. It may include content on coercion, gendered stereotypes, power imbalances, for example. But for many, consent education will be limited to what the law says about consent, and that no means no. The clue is in the name, and the focus is on that apparently transformative thing that makes an encounter sexual violence or not. I'm here to tell you that focusing only on consent is not enough, and that consent education alone will not get it done. The good news is there's something better. Allow me to pause and introduce the concept of sexual well-being. I'm mentioning this now because it's been my experience that there can be some resistance to the term sexual well-being. In one instance, a conversation I had with a colleague left me feeling like a naughty schoolgirl being reprimanded by the principal. I was told in no uncertain terms that we were to stop using the expression sexual well-being in our work regarding sexual violence prevention, because otherwise people would think we were suggesting orgasms for everyone. Firstly, when it comes to consenting participants, what's wrong with orgasms? Secondly, and far more importantly, sexual well-being is about so much more than orgasms. It includes freedom from sexual violence, harassment, unwanted sexual experiences. But it's more than the mere absence of those things. It's a positive, fulfilling existence, not one that's simply free from violence, harm, or illness. It's a feeling of confidence, safety, and autonomy in your body, your sexuality, your choices. And in a world that recognises the importance of physical, mental, even financial well-being, why on earth wouldn't we want to safeguard sexual well-being too? Let me explain how we do that. By 2019, I was determined to find the preventative solution to the problem of sexual violence and put it into action. I'd successfully applied for a Churchill Fellowship, and I took a sabbatical from the justice system to travel across Europe and North America to learn from some of the best experts on the planet on this issue and witness the systems that were working well in a number of countries around the world. I very quickly learned that focusing on violence prevention as the sole or even the primary purpose of this kind of education was deeply flawed. I met with experts in Germany, in their Department of Health, and my focus on violence prevention must have been obvious to them because in the course of our exchange, they encouraged me to understand the difference between sexual violence prevention and sexuality education, suggesting to me strongly that these were different things, related but different. To these professionals, sexual violence prevention works to supplement the baseline of sexual well-being. And this understanding of the distinction between violence prevention and education for well-being is so sophisticated in Germany that it extends into the separation of their sexual violence prevention branch from their sexuality education branch within their Federal Department of Public Health. Making the same point, an award-winning developer of relationships and sexuality education, or RSE, in England, described consent education as a deficit model because it explains sex and relationships only in terms of the presence or absence of consent. I was beginning to understand, but it hadn't quite landed for me yet. It would, though, quite spectacularly, later in my trip over a cup of coffee in a Toronto cafe. I was meeting with Dr. Alex McKay, the Executive Director of the Sex Information and Education Council of Canada. And his message to me, and I'm paraphrasing, is that access to information that people can use to make their own decisions is a right. Dr. McKay was arguing that young people are entitled to comprehensive RSE, not just consent education. See, comprehensive RSE includes consent education, but it's not limited to that, it's more holistic. Comprehensive RSE focuses on giving young people all the skills and tools and information they need to pursue happy, healthy relationships and sexual well-being, as well as sexual safety. It discusses power dynamics, bodily autonomy, communication skills, green flags, as well as red flags. And it doesn't just teach young people how to communicate in sex and intimate relationships, but when it's done well, it shows them why they should care about doing that. Sometimes I go into universities and I deliver sessions to university students on sexual well-being, consent, communication, ethics, bystander intervention. And at the end of every session, without fail, someone will say, "I wish we'd learned this at school." And every time it breaks my heart because what that person is remembering is an occasion where they needed this information and they were left wanting, perhaps with devastating consequences. In 2021, thousands and thousands and thousands of young people responded to an Instagram survey by Chanel Contos, reporting that they had experienced sexual violence or harassment, often before they left school. One of the profound messages that the results of this survey trumpeted to the world was that we must give young people this information before they need to draw on it. And what the extensive research undertaken in this field over many years and across the world has shown is that comprehensive education about relationships and sexuality works. The more you give young people accurate and relevant information, and the earlier you start to provide that information, the later they are likely to have their first sexual experiences, the less likely they are to have negative sexual experiences. Knowledge is power. Who knew? So how can we justify our failure to ensure that all young people have access to it? And this is where Dr. McKay's comment struck me when he said that access to information that can be used to make decisions is a right. And it was his use of the word right that was like a light bulb for me, and I realized that everyone I've been speaking to on my fellowship had been using similar language because healthy relationships and sexual well-being are core to the human experience. They are not a luxury. And learning how to live in order to achieve those things is something we need to do progressively from a young age. We don't just hand young people the keys to a car and say, "Best of luck, try not to crash." We teach them how to drive. And we don't just throw kids in the deep end of the swimming pool and hope they won't drown. We teach them how to swim. Not just so they don't crash and they don't drown, but so they can pursue joyful experiences. Freedom, independence. But when it comes to sex and relationships, why are we willing to just let people figure it out for themselves, even though the chances of getting it wrong might mean a traumatic experience for one person and the inside of a courtroom for another? How have we found ourselves teaching young people only to be risk-averse and avoid danger? Don't get pregnant. Don't get an STI. Don't get raped. Sometimes, don't rape. Without giving them the skills and information and knowledge they need to pursue fulfilling lives. Lives which include healthy sexual experiences beyond the absence of violence. We shouldn't be aiming for just this side of legal. We should be shooting for the other end of the spectrum. And what my research in the United Kingdom, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, Canada showed me was how RSE experts and other stakeholders have successfully implemented RSE in schools. And this is a result, in part, of listening to young people and coming to understand and acknowledge that they have a right to this information, and that by failing to provide it, we are denying them this right and leaving their well-being to chance. The right to education is enshrined in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The World Association for Sexual Health asserts that sexual rights are grounded in already recognised human rights, and that the right to education includes the right to sexuality education. In a 2010 report, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to education stressed that sexuality education ought to be considered a right in itself. If there exists a right to live free from sexual violence and a right to sexual well-being, then access to the information and education that is necessary to achieve those things must also be a right. Access to comprehensive RSE is therefore a human rights issue. Paranoia that speaking to young people about sex will encourage them to engage in sexual behaviour is popular in Australia and elsewhere around the world. And this is despite the evidence to the contrary that I mentioned earlier. In a sex ed class in England, when the kids were asked how old they thought people start having sex, one young boy put up his hand. He was about 9 years old. And he said, "It might be good to do before you retire." Age-appropriate RSE does not encourage earlier sexual activity. That fear persists though, and I suspect that's why the language of consent education has proven more palatable, more robust against opposition in recent years. The term consent education doesn't even have the word sex in it. And it's far harder to justify opposing something that's framed as protecting kids from harm, and so we may find ourselves looking at RSE from a harm prevention perspective. But we need to consider an alternative perspective, a superior perspective, one that isn't dismissed by unsubstantiated claims that a positive education about sex will make kids have sex sooner, or fear of sensationalist headlines reading "orgasms for all." While the potential for education to prevent violence before it occurs should not be minimised, we mustn't accept that harm prevention is the sole or even the primary purpose of relationships and sexuality education. We cannot simply teach young people about what to avoid, like sticking them behind the wheel of a car and only pointing out where the handbrake is. We need to show them what healthy relationships and sexual experiences look like before they have those experiences. And withholding this information until late childhood or adolescence is leaving it far too late. People don't just wake up on their 16th birthday with the ability to make ethical, nuanced, informed decisions, particularly not in a vacuum of knowledge. May we never let another young adult say, "I wish we learned this at school." As a sexual offences prosecutor and a champion of RSE, I'm often asked, what's the harm in a harm prevention approach? Isn't it a good first step as a means to the end goal of securing access to RSE? But not all ends are created equal, and we must continue to advocate for comprehensive RSE as a right in itself beyond its preventative qualities. The driving motivation behind why we are educating children and young people and the underlying purpose of that education in any given subject area is incredibly important. It shapes the curriculum, it determines what content is included, and having the right content determines how successful a program will be in achieving a specific purpose. Here in Australia, in districts, states, and countries around the world, we can leave no room for doubt. We must guarantee all children and young people access to comprehensive relationships and sexuality education. We cannot act as gatekeepers of this information. Rather, we should be guides. Our children and young people deserve nothing less.